Not again, not again, not again. Hello and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. I'm Bradley Tuck, and in today's session we're going to be talking to Zeina Maasri about Arab art and posters in 1960s Post-Colonial Beirut and Lebanon's Civil War. The session was recorded on the 21st of September 2022 as part of the Exploding Appendix Avant-Garde Art Practice and Research Group's 3-weekly meetup. If you like this and you'd like to check out more of our work, head to our website at www.explodingappendix.com or visit us on YouTube, SoundCloud, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Eventbrite or Meetup. Our sessions run in Brighton, UK, so you can, if you're based in the UK in Brighton, you can come and join us. The sessions are free, so please feel free to join us in the future. And if you're not based in Brighton, our sessions also occur on Zoom, so you can actually join us on Zoom as well. Alongside doing meetups, interviews, presentations and discussions, we also run creative projects. We have a film out at the moment called The Cake Tasting Society, and if you're watching this podcast, you can also see footage from our Disrupted Rhythms project. So if you're interested in that, we will also be having more about that project coming out soon. I think that's all I've got to say for now, so I think we'll hand over to Zeina Maasri and the rest of the group. So alongside doing meetups, interviews, presentations and discussions, we also run creative projects. We have a film out at the moment called The Cake Tasting Society, and if you're watching this podcast on video, you can also see footage from our Disrupted Rhythms project. Disrupted Rhythms is an ongoing creative investigation suited to an era of disruptive rhythms. It is a rhythm laboratory comprised of dancers, performers, cinematographers, photographers, composers, musicians, poets, intellectuals, and anyone we can seduce into participation. Our inquiry into the nature of rhythm takes us from the heartbeat to modes of production, from customs and conventions to revolutions and crises. Yet despite the grand scope of our investigation, our method starts with movement, impromptu dance, the joys of moving in space. So if you're interested in that, we will also be having more about that project coming out soon. I think that's all I've got to say for now, so I think we'll hand over to Zeina Maasri and the rest of the group.
Questions, if that's all right with you. Feel free to also, if there's any, if you want to, I've got these kind of questions as a kind of skeleton for the event, but if people have anything they want to add or follow up on, or if they want some kind of clarification, just feel free to just put your hand up or just say something. So in your first book, Off the Wall, you explore political posters in Lebanon's Civil War, which was 1975 to 1990. And then the second book, Cosmopolitan Radicalism, investigates illustration and graphic design in 1960s Beirut. And next week you have a book out called Transnational Solidarity, Anti-Colonialism in the Global Sixties. So I suppose what originally drew you to work on the intersection between politics, art and design in Beirut, Lebanon and transnationally, and how has this exploration of these topics developed?
Right. So first of all, hello everyone, now with the microphone. And thank you very much for inviting me to be here. And I'm really pleased to be able to be in a room and talking to people about my work and not in front of a screen, as the last 2 years of COVID have forced us to sort of do everything remotely. So thank you all for coming. So so the first question about my work is mostly that I'm, like some of you here, I'm originally trained as an artist, as a visual artist and a graphic designer, and I was teaching graphic design for a long time. But I'm interested in the political aspects of design practices and also of aesthetic and visual practices. Even I had that as a designer. And on the side, I was also involved in activist projects. So I was interested in the intersections between political activism and artistic practices, and that's what I was trying to teach at the I was actually living and based in Beirut at the time. And I was trying to teach something that where we can think about visual practices and design practices away from the commercial sides of things, but thinking how these can possibly contribute to political change or have something that is other than their commercial applications. So that was my interest in that in the intersection. But also, as I was teaching there, I was beginning to realize that, not beginning, but that there's hardly anything written about the visual culture and the history of graphic design in the Arab world, let alone in Lebanon, where I was actually living, and I have lived the Civil War, for instance. Nothing was written about how artists actually contributed, not to the warring factions, but to the politics of the time through political posters, through different artistic interventions. So that sparked my research, and bit by bit I began in the first book, which is Off the Wall, to try to write an alternative history of the Civil War through its everyday visual wars, if you want, and narratives that usually we don't read about in official war narratives or books. And I sort of realized that I was becoming a historian as I was doing this, and moved away from my practice as a designer. And from there, I decided to pursue research into this subject, because I realized there's really nothing written on it. And came to the University of Brighton to do a PhD in 2013, which so the PhD that I worked on is actually, the result of it was the second book that you have in your hands, Cosmopolitan Radicalism, in which I began to dig deeper into understanding, both theoretically and look into more archives that have been neglected or abandoned, of printed visual culture from what I call the long 60s, a period from the 50s to the mid-70s, before the Civil War, and trying to understand again and again the relation between politics and artistic practices in the Arab world at key historical moments of political change. Does that answer the question?
Yeah,
I don't know if people want to ask as well.
Yeah, also really do feel free if anyone has anything that they want to ask.
If I've missed something, or if you want to respond or ask anything about some of these.
I think the ideal is that it hopefully feels a little bit like a living room that we're having chatting. So if anyone does want to say anything, just feel free to add something.
Like the murals in Belfast.
Yes. So that's that. When I was working on the posters for the Civil War in Lebanon, I was interested in understanding also how images operate within a divided cities, how they mark territory, they create boundaries between one street and another. You move and you realize you're safe or not safe, depending on how you relate to the images that actually are within the streets. So that's something that can be compared to Belfast, and I've had conversations with people who worked on that in Belfast, and in some of the collections in the linen is it called the Linen Library, Belfast? Yeah. So if we think of posters in their context within a city, in a context of civil war, they do act what I try to argue in the first book as sites of symbolic struggle. So they are part of a visual war that is ideologically manifested and that demarcates territories.
A mural is different from a flyer or a poster.
Yes, that's a very interesting. Yeah.
In kind of level of.
The scale is different, of course, in the way you experience it in the street, but it's also different in the way that the poster is generally, and the ones I looked at were reproduced in multiples, so you'd see them pasted in different parts of the city, or they can also travel, and that's something that was interesting for me in the second book, that posters are sent to different places as parts of networks of solidarity. For instance, you would see in Algeria in the late 60s, for instance, posters that was in solidarity with Palestine or with somewhere else in Africa or Latin America, and these were objects that traveled in multiples.
So, in your opening chapter of Cosmopolitan Radicalism, you explore how tourism posters and advertising contributed to an impression of Beirut being the Paris of the East, a place associated with modernity, consumer cosmopolitanism, and fashionability. You also note that the image of the bikini-clad woman on the beach, designed for the economist public, thus needs to be seen in its disjunctive relation to the figure of the gun-carrying guerrilla fighter, or Palestinian fidaya, who was beginning to make her cause internationally visible from Beirut in the same year. What were the tensions and contradictions surrounding the image designed for tourism adverts at the time?
So this is the bikini-clad women that was designed for an economist ad by the National Council for Tourism in Lebanon in 1969. That Bradley is referring to. So this is the book mainly, that the Cosmopolitan Radicalism is looking at this period of the long 60s, trying to understand how Beirut was becoming around that time a nodal city for many different aspects. One of them is that it's the idea of it becoming the Paris of the East was that sense of cosmopolitan tourism, a node in tourism on the Eastern Mediterranean, and it's a time where there were other countries around the Mediterranean competing for that attention and being part of a circuit of travel, mass tourism on the Mediterranean. So there is that sense of glamour of a very modern, golden 60s, if you want. But at the same time, and then you can see that in the way that the Tourism Council has tried to promote Lebanon, and the way that in part of Beirut was actually living that sense of a glamorous modern city. But what I try to uncover in the book is that this is hiding another aspect of the city, or another aspect of Lebanon, in which actually Beirut was becoming a nodal city for new anti-colonial politics in the region, but also part of a connecting node for what was called then third worldist struggles, so struggles of national liberation struggles, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggles that crossed from Latin America to Africa to Asia, and that sort of were connected together. And Beirut was central, was becoming central, particularly through after 1967, specifically central to the Palestinian liberation struggle. So I don't know how many of you know about the history of that. So you have Palestine with the establishment of Israel in 1948. Part of Palestine was annexed, and in 1967 there was a second defeat, or a war that led to the defeat of the Arab countries that were involved in that war with Israel, that actually led to further annexation of of Palestinian territories, and in both 48 and 67 there's been waves of major refugees, Palestinian refugees into the region, and mainly in Lebanon. So so there was so the Palestinian refugees in Lebanon played an important, Beirut was both a refugee city but also a space for political struggle. So the connection that happened after 1967, politically, historically, made the struggle for the let's say Lebanon, a bridgehead for the struggle for the liberation of Palestine. And in that sense, it was called, referred to at that time, the Arab Hanoi, in connection to North Vietnam, in reference to North Vietnam. So that's something that the idea of a Paris of the East hides, or that's that sort of cosmopolitan in its European orientation of cosmopolitanism. That reference to a colonial, so the Paris of the East. If you think Lebanon was colonized, was a French mandate.
When did the French leave?
43.
Oh.
The national liberation is 1943, but the armies left in 47. Yeah. So there is a colonial reference even in the term Paris of the East.
I think did you use the term nodal city?
Yeah.
Can you explain what that is?
So okay, that's a very important question. So in one way of in my work is trying to understand how cities become spaces of interaction that are transnational, where where people are, there's flows of people, of ideas, of images, and they intersect in a particular space, and that space can be just like sometimes like the space we are in now is very small, but at the same time we're all coming from different places now, perhaps, and we intersect and we interact, and there are encounters that happen. And there are certain moments within histories of particular cities that actually where there is there's a very rich and let's say an accentuated flow that creates creates particular encounters, and in my research on Beirut, this is where I think that my argument is that Beirut was a nodal city in that 60s on many fronts, and on many levels. One in terms of like the tourism industry that was happening, but also in terms of the politics of the circulation of ideas and revolutionary ideas at that time. So it's a node within that connects the city to other places, and through the people or through the images that travel, or through, sometimes people look at the flow of capitals within particular nodes, like London city, for instance. I'm more interested in images and politics and cultural flows. Yeah. So it's trying to understand the city beyond the national framework, and trying to look at the flows that are transnational, that create particular encounters.
So these images were in Western magazines, not in Beiruti magazines?
So the image on the left was in The Economist.
Yeah, okay.
But they were designed in Lebanon. And this is a poster by the same tourism council of that promoted Lebanon in different languages as part of that tourism campaign. And what I meant is the images of the bikini-clad women hide is something else that we look at the next one.
Sorry.
is that around the same time, I don't know if this has become an iconic image. This is Layla Khalid, who was part of Palestinian guerrilla fighters and who hijacked an airplane and was known to have led a group to have done so. And her image was also in the news at the same time as the Economist ads. So this was, and that organization happened from Lebanon, but it was also part of that hijacking. Was part of, one could argue, yes, it was a terrorist like a terrorist tactic.
Is that the Red Brigades?
No, the Red Brigades.
Sorry.
Yeah, the Red Army faction.
Italian. Yeah.
Red Army faction, who organized also in solidarity with the Palestinians another hijacking. So there were a series of hijacking to try to call attention to the Palestinian struggle. These were the tactics that they were using. But that's another iconic image that is of a different political struggle, and that also had these sorts of these contrasting images were the reason why I began that research, and they were happening around that time. That sort of tension and contradiction between the claim over Beirut as the Paris of the East, right, and the claim over Beirut as the Arab Hanoi. And this is what I understand as they were part of circuits of flows that were transnational, but that overlapped in some ways, but also were in tension with one another, were conflicting. But there's definitely some overlap. So I was interested, the whole book is trying to unpack some of the overlaps and some of the tensions of that very intense moment and period in Lebanon's history. So in the image on the left is, to your left, yes, is the cover of the newspaper, very, very mainstream newspaper supplement. It's the cultural supplement that comes on the Sunday, a bit like the Observer here for the Guardian. That also tries, that is a collage by an artist, Waddah Faris, for the cover that shows basically also how that moment is. This is 1968, and with the question, where is Lebanon's youth in the revolution? So there was Beirut was part of a revolutionary moment that was happening globally in the late 60s, and so that's important to think about. The radicalism of the image of Layla Khalid, but is part of another youth revolution, and that is in touch, that is in connection with other youth around the world, and not only just the third worldist anti-colonial struggle. But
can I ask a question? There's something a little bit strange that I hear. Because you're saying, oh, there are two images of Beirut, yeah, but you also seem to say that there is no Beirut, in a sense that it's either Paris or Hanoi. Yeah, it's kind of like saying, well, London is Beirut of Britain, sort of thing. Yeah. Is this part of the narrative? Or?
I think it's because it's not that there is no Beirut, or it's whether it's not a question where is the real Beirut. It's a question of how Beirut is represented, imagined, and lived. Okay, and I think images have that role. Sure. And it's a good question, because it really puts us to think about how is it that. Is it that these images are speaking of something that people there did not relate to, or is it something that is only a claim? Does it have a basis in reality or not? But what I'm trying to say, and I think what I'm trying to understand, is how do images create particular representations that are both that are part of an imagination of. And that imagination is is usually struggled over, that can be in tension with other imaginations, and that these images and imaginations are also part of how cities are lived. So it's not necessarily in contrast with a real Beirut. That's
Sure. I was just kind of like thinking in terms of colonialism, and that part of colonialism is the taking away whatever it is there, as while kind of making a claim to whatever it is there.
I think
and I also noticed that in terms of kind of more in terms of names rather than visions, but for example, there was unit or some kind of army faction in Lebanon that was called phalangists or something like that. Yeah. And that comes from the Spanish fascists, whatever brigades. Yeah. So again, it's kind of like something from some other place being found in Beirut.
Yeah, so the phalangists is an old Lebanese nationalist right-wing party that's founded in the 30s or 40s, and that becomes a very important player in the Civil War later in 75, and becomes a surrogate of the state, basically, in a counter-revolutionary surrogate of the state. Which I talk about in the other book, the first book of the wall, and we can see some of their posters. But I think the question of whether if they call themselves phalangists, that's following the Spanish. But that's true. They were inspired, but it's also important to understand that some of these nationalist politics were also in circulation in the 30s, and some of these ideologies were in circulation globally. So so it's not necessarily directly colonial. It's a group that fashions itself based on some sort of ideology. I mean, otherwise, these ideologies travel just like communism travels. Communism dream is to be internationalist, right? So it's I think it's different than a colonialism that imposes a very particular set of beliefs on and does not allow. I mean,
is it not a colonialized mind in a sense?
I think it's more complex than that. Okay. There are definitely some ruling ideas in the world, and they do have at certain moments ruling, and they're powerful enough to actually colonize. But I think that's the trick, is that it's not direct. I would call it then hegemonic ideas, and it's like you adhere to these ideas by consent, rather than under force for those who do, I guess. I don't know. Any thoughts on this? Because it's an interesting, important question.
Well, some of this, you could make a parallel argument about London in the last 10 days or so, couldn't you? I mean, there's a sort of idiocy that has colonised London, and not just London, but the entire so-called United Kingdom. In one sense, one could talk about this sort of, quote, scare quotes, love of the monarchy in terms of people's minds being colonised. You could make that argument, but that's a sense of colonialism which is very different from nationalist colonialisms, and I think that distinction is an important one. It's not that somebody's come along to London and sort of brought their army with them and taken the place over. It's us lot doing it to ourselves. So I think, and that's just one example. I mean, I could go on and on and on. Don't worry, I won't. But that seems one interesting thing that one might expand on, where these ideas come from, how they congealed, how they emerged in a particular time and place. And why are the English so obsessed with the monarchy in a way that other nations appear not to be? I've no idea, but I've been asking myself that quite a lot over the last 10 days or so.
Is it the English or the Brits?
Sorry?
Is it the English or the British?
Very much the English.
Okay.
And after all, I mean, Great Britain is an English colonial enterprise historically, so there's another parallel there.
One could say that that's a form of ideology that is at work.
Yeah, I mean,
right?
that's
So
the word I was...
and I think sometimes we use different terms to try to conceptualize and understand what's actually happening. So whether we want to call it colonialism and have a particular explanation for it, or whether we call it ideology and have a Marxist explanation to it, is another way of how, or hegemony, for instance, is another way of trying to explain how people adhere to particular ideas that seem to work that don't serve their interests, but actually they subscribe to it by consent. Right? And I think there's all sorts of ideas that are like that.
Well, it's like one of the things that's interesting about the beginning of Off the Wall is you start by critiquing the idea of propaganda versus, and actually challenging the way in which we might think about propaganda rather than as this like singular authority producing one particular discourse.
Yeah.
And the way that in a way, the Lebanese Civil War has multiple discourses going on.
Yes, competing ones,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which sort of, in some ways, also fits with the next question, actually. So in the following chapter of Cosmopolitan Radicalism, looks at literature from the journal Hiwa, which ran from 1962 but stopped abruptly when in 1966 it was revealed to be it was revealed that its funding body, the Congress of Cultural Freedom, was a covert CIA operation. Nonetheless, you challenge interpretations that focus only on the CIA and sideline, quote, the important role of contributors to the CCF and its affiliated journals. Such an interpretation, you note, renders all participants in the affiliated journals passive dupes, manipulated by outside forces, and with no agency of their own. So how should we think about Hiwa and what might be its insights in terms of the exploration of modernism and cultural freedom?
Yeah, a very close reading, which is amazing, of the book. So I think the connection with the previous question is around something I'm really interested in, is the question of agency. So how do we think we're acting as free subjects, right? And think that we're adhering out of our free will to to that particular idea, or not, to monarchy or to fascism or and I think that comes back again in that magazine Hiwar. We have some slides. So it's the one on the top. And Hiwar was an avant-garde magazine in the Arab world that was it started in 1962 up until 66. The last issue was in the beginning of 67, and it was part of an international network of magazines that were intellectual, that were avant-garde in terms of poetry, literature, arts, so I don't know if you are familiar with the magazine Encounter, which was in Britain, in the UK. So Encounter was part of that network. Quest in India was also part of that network. There's two others there's in Latin America, a few, and trying to remember the names. It will come to. There's others in other parts of Africa as well. So it was an international network. They shared articles translated, and it was just really quite modernist in its approach to the arts. And with a very liberal claim that art has nothing to do with politics. Art operates in that modernist framework of arts for art's sake. There's no space for ideology here. Now, what's turned out to be quite a shock for all those who contributed is that in 1966, all this network turned out to be funded covertly by the CIA, including Encounters and Quest and all. So it's not just this magazine. So it was a huge operation of the CIA in the Cold War times to win over, again by consent, the ideas to rule, to have control over the ideas of art and artistic and literary practices being devoid of politics as an opposition within the Cold War to all the, sort of more politically orientated arts. And it was part of the rivalry during the Cold War. And to win over basically the hearts and minds over art in the liberal idea of art and of modernism. And that was a big shock for all those who contributed, even the editor. The editor is a very well-known, famous Palestinian, based in Beirut, poet, Tawfiq Sayer, who actually studied in Cambridge, was teaching in SOAS, and was recruited to edit this journal from Beirut. And it recruited, if we can see some of the previous, it brought on its pages. The next one. The next one. Yeah, there's a few images. Yeah. So it's brought on its pages a dialogue between contemporary contemporary artists and writers and poets that you'd not seen before. And this is a space. It gave space to women artists on its pages. Quite experimental artwork. So this is the work of Juliana Serafim. The next one. Slides. This is for also Halim Jordak, a Lebanese artist, very abstract. So it's the modernist art on the pages of a magazine juxtaposed with literature, poetry, criticism. It was an intellectual space that was very important and very highly regarded, but it was a liberal space as well. So it's claimed that art can be autonomous from politics. So when it was scandalous when it was discovered to be that the money was coming, the funding was coming from. So the whole Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was what united all these magazines and lots of other cultural activities around the world, was a covert operation of the CIA. And this was quite dramatic in a country such as Lebanon, in the region, because it actually brought on board a lot of Arab artists and intellectuals, not only in Lebanon, and was distributed across the Arab world. It was quite scandalous because of that imperialist machination of the CIA, and because of it just came right at the moment where the 1967 war had, the Arab-Israeli war had happened, and it was quite...
Is it just bad timing?
I think there are contingencies of time that made it so. So it became... the time was crucial in the sense of how this was seen, and the artist, the intellectual Tawfiq Sayer, was seen as treasonous, basically. So it's not. So Encounter, for instance, would not be seen as treason to England, but you'd be doubtful of its content. But in a context where war is happening, where it's not a cold war, it's a very hot war, then there's you're accountable for treason, basically. And I think that's where the chapter is called the
Which I get.
Yes, it's a play on the hot and cold of the different contexts.
I mean, aren't embassies doing this all the time?
They are.
Trying to encourage all these things.
You're
Soft power thing.
Absolutely.
Is that about timing, or is it about...
There's several things. There's timing, the contingency of time, but there's also something else. It's the hot Third War and the cultural Cold War.
Yeah.
So it's thinking of how the Cold War manifested very differently in places that were living anti-colonial struggles, which were actually very hot, where people's lives were at stake, where people's dignities were at stake. So this sort of money coming in is not just a form of diplomacy between equal partners, like the money that, for instance, the whole financing of Europe and what diplomacy does, as you say, embassies do, that's their role. And some might want to argue that this is called soft power and diplomatic art and diplomacy. I argue that we can't think of diplomacy when there's unequal relations of power here, and when this is happening at a very crucial time of struggles for liberation, and people are dying in these causes. So it's not diplomacy, and diplomacy assumes that there's mutual respect for those who are in that relation of diplomacy. But when you're funding the arms to a particular another colonial power, then, and you are regarded as a colonial power, then that's counterinsurgency. That's
remember in New Labour they built some embassy, something in Russia, they filled it full of Brit art objects from the Damien Hirst, Tracy Emin school, and they shipped it all out to Russia, to an embassy there as part of their brand, their package, their...
When was that?
Cool Britannia.
I guess in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
It's just an example of an ongoing promotion of relationships.
That was sort of open. Everybody knew that these objects, these images, whatever, they come.
This example was
nobody knew that the CIA funds it. That's the
difference. If you've been upfront about it,
in some ways, kind of like, hey, we're selling arms to these people, and we found these kind of things.
They were obviously doing it. There must have been some motive under that as well.
There are always motives, but the point is that it was known who funds it and why. Everybody knew why it is in Russia and not in Nigeria.
Can you mention the name of the magazine again? I didn't get that down. The one in
Britain?
Called? No, that's Encounter, isn't it? The one
Encounter,
but the one in Palestine.
The Lebanon, it's Hewar.
Okay.
HEWAR.
Okay, great.
It's, I think, but it's pixelated.
I can't quite see it.
Which means that dialogue, and I think why it becomes your point that this is because it's covert, it actually makes things a bit worse. It's also because it's operated under the modernist idea that art has nothing to do with politics. Art can be autonomous, can be a space for freedom. And then that whole claim of freedom just completely collapses on itself, right? When you realize that it's actually that it's just funded for political purposes and for one particular idea. So I think it just makes things difficult. But again, so my point about them, it's important to understand because there's been some writings about Hiwar, not much. and other magazines, and they've been written from what I think is the perspective of the CIA, and the perspective of look at the horrible CIA, what they've done. Yes, of course we know what they've done, but let's try to, what I try to do here is let's try to understand what did the Arab artists and intellectuals who made this journal, what were their agenda? And how their agenda was co-opted by the CIA, rather than seeing them only as passive dupes to the machinations and orchestrations of a worldwide operation of the CIA. Let's see what they wanted, and maybe they wanted something that, and I try to understand sometimes these contingencies that sort of, it's. And not to only look at the side of power, but try to see how they were not just victims of something, but they actually were active agents in making that operation, that idea global, and where they fell into it and how they fell into it. But
do you want to argue that that's a parallel with Encounter, or that it's a slightly different situation from Encounter?
I don't know Encounter well enough, but I would want to say that there are definitely some parallels, because many of those Bertrand Russell or these people who wrote for Encounters didn't know that they were actually part of that CIA funding, and if they knew, they probably would not have contributed.
I'm sure you're, at least I hope you're right, but I suppose I'm still struck with the question, why on earth didn't these people ask who funds the bloody magazine?
It was known that it's the Congress for Cultural Freedom.
But that's the difference. What wasn't known was that was a covert organisation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's where it seems to me that so far as I know about it, which isn't very, the situation with Encounter was slightly different. Nobody seemed to ask who funds Encounter.
Here.
Yeah. I mean, this was, in a way, what the people writing for here, in Lebanon, were politically much more sophisticated than the new left or new leftish intellectuals in places like the UK, who didn't ask themselves some very basic questions.
I don't know if they didn't. I think, and I also wouldn't say that Encounter was a new left. It was more liberal, and I think all the network were liberal.
Yes.
If anything, left liberal. Some of them, and I think they different contributions in the Arabic one. It wasn't homogeneous in terms of political leanings, but they were definitely not a radical left. And
no, that's true.
And it's also, they knew their position. They knew somehow that within the art world and intellectual world at that time, there were these very, binary divisions of the Cold War, and they thought they were outside of these and playing on but it just was not possible. They were co-opted, or they were on the edge.
Yeah, I mean, there's some evidence that some contributors actually did know.
In Encounters.
Yeah, but were understood themselves as part of the, if you like, civilizing
mission
role of the CIA. George Orwell, for instance, there's considerable evidence about this, which is very sad. But it seems in retrospect that a lot of contributors just didn't ask the basic questions, and that seems I'm not saying it's completely different, but that's a slightly different emphasis.
Yeah, that's the difference with Lebanon. In Lebanon or in the Arab world, there were questions right from the beginning about the funding, because it is a hot zone. Again, it's a hot war,
Exactly.
and there is a struggle of, so anti-colonialism played differently in relation to the Cold War binaries, and so everybody was always dubious of money, foreign money, basically.
Yes.
And we're spending perhaps a
Yeah.
lot of time
Yeah,
on the
we are, so
questions.
maybe- That's fine. We can. So maybe I'll move on to the. So quoting El Tournay's statement, Islamic abstraction preceded European abstraction by 13 centuries. You add, his statement was part of a wider discourse shared by Arab modern artists and critics who in the early 1980s could reiterate, alongside post-colonial history, that the originality of the European avant-garde hinged on its disavowed cultural encounters with an appropriation of the non-West. In a period of decolonization, Arab nationalism, and third worldist liberation struggles, how did artists like Helmi El Tournay develop an aesthetic of place-based modernism?
Thank you. Should we look at the
The
other?
next page.
I think the next page there might be.
Oh,
This is also from Hiwar.
Yeah.
This is the work of Ibrahim al-Salahi, who was a Sudanese artist now residing in the UK. He had a major retrospective in Tate Modern not too long ago. But again, that's just the kind of artwork. He was an emerging artist then. That was surely he didn't know that it was CIA funded. So yeah, then to come to the question. So this is Hilmi Touni's work, and that's Bradley's question about a quotation that I use. I cite Touni saying that. So can we look at the 3 slides and then come back to discuss that?
The next one.
Yeah, that's also Hilmi Touni's work. And the next one too, that's also Hilmi Touni's work. And one of the key questions, and I think that again comes back to some of the discussion earlier, is about one of the problems in art history is for a very long time, the modernism outside of the Western world was something that was not looked seriously into, and it was thought of as something that would be derivative of the West, that i.e. lacking its own originality. And if any one of you studied art or art history, you'd see that you'd have options to. So modernism is mostly Western, but your only access to art of other parts of the world or world art would be pre-modern. So Islamic art, African arts, other forms, other world cultures, art, but modernism was always something that would be exclusively up until the 80s, basically, and still nowadays called to decolonize art history because of specifically the problem lies with modernism, because of that idea of it's inherent to the idea of modern art to be original. Therefore, if something outside the West looks like derivative of the West or not, then it's like lacking originality. So one of the problems that this is modernist artists in the Arab world or in India or other parts of the world face is that, but our work is not, we're not imitating the West. You know, modernism is also something we adhere to, but it's also something that we've adapted to our own local cultures, to our own histories. It's like other things that just get to be translated, rethought, and it was a big debate from the 60s and 70s around questions of authenticity. How can you be both modern as an artist and authentic to where you are? That idea of being place-based. Can we have a place-based modernism, or is it something that's just totally cosmopolitan? And these were the questions that Hilmi Touni was asking himself among other artists. And when he talks about, but the question about one of the key formal experiments in modernist visual arts is abstraction. And he says, well, abstraction is not something that is inherently Western. It's also that abstraction in modern art rests on disavowed interests and claims or borrowing from other cultures, and such as the Islamic art. So some of the patterns that were used, so some of the, for instance, there's work by Paul Klee, who's one of the key European artists. He's inspired by some of the calligraphic patterns and colors of Morocco. We know very well, for instance, Picasso's work, that the way that the way that it's not just abstracted and that sort of cubist assemblage is something that is also inspired by African art. But that's disavowed. It's as if in one way Europe can be inspired from other cultures and there's no problem about authenticity and originality, but it's, if you're on the other side, then why is it that you're lacking authenticity and originality if you're also in dialogue with other modern artists of the world? So Hilmi Touni asks these questions and says that abstraction anyway is something that is inherently part of our local culture, which is historically dates back to Islamic arts and arabesque and abstractions. So abstraction dates back, I don't know how many thousands of years before the Europeans began to use it in their own modern art practices. So we can claim it, and it is authentic. That's something you see in his work, where there's that sort of flattened ornamental motifs within the figures that borrows from some of the traditions of miniature painting, but at the same time is very graphically just very colorful. It's also in dialogue of some of the psychedelic art even, and you can see that in the images next to it, or next one. Like that. But so it's here he's actually reinterpreting, for instance, Fatimid calligraphy, which is a very old tradition of style of calligraphic writing, but with very modern treatment of the image. And I can read it, so if you don't read Arabic you can't read it, but you can see it has reminiscence, it is in dialogue with some of the work of the early 70s in Europe, but it's also something that is adapted, has a sense of locality. So that's what some of the artists like Hilmi Touni were trying to seek, or graphic designers, with that sense of a place-based modernism, and to counter the claim of their work being derivative.
I also liked your analysis of that poster as well, the relations of sort of this idea of sort of exploring sort of equality and gender as well.
Yeah.
And there seems to actually, a lot of his posters actually have some quite important, they play with gender a bit.
He does that. This is I think someone before in the audience pointed to the poster, the folkloric posters with a woman and that's the same artist. So he plays with that patterns, embroidery, gender, and this is a poster for the Arabic book fair, which in fact the drawing that he did became the mascot and the logo for that book fair, still used up until today. So this was done in 1974, and he's here putting that sort of embrace of between the couple on equal level, and they sort of, there's a triangular relation to the book, and it's also he uses gold, so he tries to refer to the Islamic arts of bookmaking and
Excuse me, I just wonder if you could speak a little to the challenges of researching something, if we're talking about posters that are probably made as ephemeral products. How well preserved are they, and how do you go about finding them, and how do you know where they existed, where they were put up? This seems incredibly challenging.
Yeah, it is. So this is the work of decades actually.
Yeah,
and especially that now recently some of the libraries and there's some growing interest in archives to collect this material and to preserve it. But for a long time, when I began the Off the Wall, the political posters, no one cared about it, and it is ephemeral. So it is hard work to locate them, to work. So I've been building networks of collectors. So some are private collectors, some are themselves politically, for instance, partisans of a certain political group, so they've kept things. So for Off the Wall, the Civil War one, I've been digitizing, and I can show you later a website where actually all these collections are put together into an archive, and in a way that creates a memory and a public memory and public access to the Civil War history through the posters. So I think that's important to once that it's searching, collecting, digitizing, and then putting it into a, easily accessible collections for other scholarship, for other people to look at. Yeah,
that's great.
It's So posters are not always in a great shape, and because it's paper, it's not always well preserved.
I think in a way it's doubly impressive because it's like for a war period as well. Like,
that's even worse. I wrote about that and how difficult it is because that's, especially in a civil war, people were on the move, and particularly political organizations, and they were also looted, bombed, sabotaged. So, and that's not the thing that you would want to keep and travel with you. Try carrying a bunch of posters. It's just not. Yeah, it's and I tried to locate sometimes photographs of streets where you could see some posters from the wartime. Yes. It's the most exciting thing sometimes, like, I can spot a poster on the wall.
It's a real scavenger hunt.
Yeah, it is. But it's collective work. It's not, I work with people on this, there's been, so since I've been writing, my former students become collectors, it's been building up.
So welcome back everyone. So I'll leap into my next question, and then we can just play it as we've been doing it. In 1970, Palestinian artist, activist, and critic Kamal Bulata wrote, Beirut's art galleries began to transform into a body without soul, for the soul is freed in the streets, refugee camps, and guerrilla bases. Like many cities in the long and global 1968, art shifted from the galleries to militant action in the streets. How did this particularly manifest in Beirut?
I think that also answers the question about preserving posters. You can see the shape, the state of that one. Yeah, so this is, Kamal Bulata wrote this as part of a long statement about what happened to art after 1967, after the major defeat and further exile of Palestinians, and it was a defeat for the Arab world. So it's a moment where art began to be politicized, and those who were, for instance, writing or contributing to magazines such as Hiwar, which was more liberal, felt that there is an urgency for their art to actually be in touch with what's happening politically. It was a very strong, very traumatic, actually, political experience at the time. So art could not just sit on the side and just be bystanders of such changing political, and they felt the responsibility to do something. And the idea that I think that quote captures beautifully the art that goes out of the gallery space, the art that actually is secluded within its own elite art becomes part of the street and spaces of the everyday. And particularly what I was interested in is that how these artists did that, particularly by their art taking the form of print. So whether that be posters, whether that be postcards, stamps, so mail art, or leaflets and magazines. So their art was, they felt that they were also in the avant-garde as well, in the political sense of it. They were the vanguard of change as well. They had a responsibility and it was a revolutionary moment, as I talked about at the beginning, that Arab Hanoi was connected to a revolutionary moment in the Arab world, in Beirut in particular, and in connection to the liberation of Palestine. And that this is where we start seeing these artists, so their work being part, just like in Paris 68, or in fact that sort of revolutionary art was happening in different parts of the world. And that's what was going on in Beirut at that time. So this is the work. This is Kamal Boulata's work. This is a postcard that was part of a series that other artists also contributed to. And on the left is a poster that's designed by Ismail Shammout, another Palestinian artist, and it says Vietnam, Palestine, and that again captures the idea of the Arab Hanoi, and this is sort of the mantle going from one place. This is in the early 73. From Vietnam to Palestine as another, that's the idea, coming back to the node. So Vietnam being symbolic for anti-colonial resistance and national liberation. So that's a Vietnamese freedom fighter, or what was known then as a freedom fighter, passing on the mantle of victory. That's it says victory to a Palestinian fidai, or freedom fighter. And what I find very interesting here is that if you look at them, if you don't look at besides the headgear, the freedom fighters are the same, right? It's a common struggle. It's only the headgear that makes them, locates them within their own national struggle. So whether the straw hat, or in the Palestinian example, which you see it here also, is the kafiyeh, which is, again, both of these are symbols of peasants, old national, local peasant gear. So that's also an understanding of revolutionary struggle that comes out of not the urban class, but the countryside, and that's something that was part of the third worldist imagination, and of the countryside, sort of an idea of a peasant struggle, an armed struggle that comes from the countryside and encircles the cities. So yeah, I think I'm talking. I went beyond the.
That's great.
There's other examples maybe of these. If you want to ask questions about it, so yeah, that's interesting, because this is where you see how the art itself travels in different places. So this is on the cover of a radical left magazine, a Palestinian leftist magazine. The same work of Boulata. So Boulata and other contemporary artists began to contribute to this al-Hadaf. It's the target for was the organ for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which was, the magazine began in 1969, and you start seeing so this is a magazine that would be distributed to the camps, to the guerrilla bases, and to also the urban intellectuals, and you'll start seeing that someone who's actually a guerrilla fighter would be reading and been looking at a new aesthetic sensibility of a revolutionary art that magazine. So many contributed to it. On the left is the editor-in-chief of that magazine, Ghassan Kanafani, who is a Palestinian intellectual based in Beirut. And this is his office, and you can see how poster art is something that was so important, but also it gives you a sense of how that office in Beirut is a microcosm of a world revolution, not just a secluded space. So yeah, and in fact, Al Hadaf used to had there's a section in it that had that was called Revolution Everywhere. So it was always informing the reader of where different locations in the global south where revolution was taking place. So people, there's a sense of where you're not alone in the world, that sense of solidarity, that you're part of a bigger revolutionary moment, and that was very empowering for whoever read and subscribed to these ideas. And the images, and there was also a section, the most beautiful poster, and every week where you had this magazine, you had a poster from different struggles in the world in it. So that the aesthetics of revolutionary struggle, of solidarity, of not being alone, that sort of linking was something that was very important through visual culture, through artistic practice. Yeah, sorry, I can go on forever about these.
I'm sorry to stop it.
Yeah, don't be sorry. I'm happy that you do.
I'm kind of wondering how revolution was defined.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, for example, I'm looking at this sort of years, sort of like end of 60s, beginning of 70s. I don't see imagery from what I associate with the revolution at that time. So
what would be?
It would be, for example, the feminist revolution.
Yeah.
And what I do feel, I get, maybe I'm misreading it, but I get a sense of physical, violent struggle.
A masculine one.
As being sort of like defined as a revolutionary move, yeah, which is something that feels very alien to me, to be honest. Yeah.
But that was part of what anti-colonial struggle meant then. So I think it's also different. The struggle for national liberation was understood through armed means of struggle. So that was a revolutionary. So revolution, it can be thought of whether in this, like think of at that, especially in the global south, if you think of the writings of Mao at that time, of armed struggle, that revolution comes out of the barrel of the guns, or you go across the south to Latin America, and there's Che Guevara as another icon that talks about guerrilla warfare, gives strategies of guerrilla warfare. 1966, there's a meeting in Cuba of the different, it's called that is an important moment for what is called the tricontinental, so the meeting of different liberation struggles, anti-imperialist and anti-colonial liberation struggle, which began to actually give license, if you want, that this is the only means and way for us to actually to violence, or what is called revolutionary violence then, and armed struggle is the only form of revolution is a way to ignite the revolution, if you want. And that was something that was debated, thought of, and was quite an important moment, the idea of, and that's something we'll come back to perhaps later, but that, and you might, one of the key texts of the moment is The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, talks exactly about that violence is almost like a cleansing force and a necessary one for those who have been colonized, because this is how they have been. There's no way to overcome their new identities except through this, and that they've been actually colonized by violence, right? So, and it's there's there's different moral justifications for the use of violence, revolutionary violence. You can go back to Lenin as well, but at that moment there is that a new a revision of Marxist thought in terms of revolution to coming from the global south to think about that violence is a means to ignite the revolution rather than waiting for for people to be ready, and and that's a change that happens in the global south. You want to ask? Yes.
I think just a reflection on what you were saying in terms of also kind of the framing of demonizing anti-imperialist struggles, and not only anti-imperialist struggles, but also, for instance, anti-racism struggles happening in the US or in Europe, seeing them as violent and showing violence as something to be demonized. And even when we think of how anti-racist struggles in the US, for instance, how there's a peaceful struggles as being seen as the ones to put forward as good ones, like even showing certain activists as only being peaceful, like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King. Actually, they were part of wider activist groups that did use violence as a means against violence that was imposed on them by state and non-state actors. So that's just quite an interesting conversation around the use of violence, and Frantz Fanon's reflections of use of violence is necessary when faced with colonial violence. But I also had a reflection in terms of the question you asked, the last question you asked, Bradley, around art being political and also art being political when found in the street, and thinking about how, for instance, the war in the West Bank being a politicized site for street art, for Palestinian freedom fighters, and also those being covered up by the Israeli state or by so it's just a reflection in terms of like parallel of that happening in Beirut and different parts in Lebanon, and how that's also happening today in Palestine, and how it's ephemeral because it's street art and it's not publicized, but it's just again fighting for space but through art.
It's great, thank you. It's the parallel is interesting because it's different tools, but there's that, it's that ephemerality, that part of occupying the street, that part of wanting for the artist to speak to the larger public rather than to be confined into a gallery space, and art being for art's sake, but art for political change. That's the moment, and it remains as something, as a tool, as a weapon for artists, if you want, today, even in occupation, like protest movements, and you've seen what was called the Arab Spring as well, and the graffitis, and that's where art actually becomes part of a communal, collective, public space, and it's an important aesthetic tool and political. Creates a space of imagination, a space for dreaming of a different future, and a space of transgressing the existing colonial reality. And it has a very powerful, like on the wall, on the apartheid wall, what is called, it's something that's very specific to the contemporary Palestinian reality. And again, you have forms of solidarity where you have artists from around the world traveling to paint on that side of the wall and to transgress it. Like that. We've got Banksy, like a famous, but there's also less famous ones, and activists traveling to do that. And I think that was something that we saw in the late 60s, but in printed form. So print was the means to circulate art and make it part of the public realm in a way that perhaps digital art is somehow today. So print traveled. In Cuba, there was the Organization of Solidarity with People of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, OSPAL, which came out of that tricontinental movement produced posters that were in solidarity with different struggles of the global south, and numerous posters, beautiful posters that are now collectibles, and they were in circulation. I found them in Beirut in some abandoned radical left from the 60s. So they were about to be thrown away. But yeah, they traveled, they were sent to subsidiary networks. So just like Ghassan Kanafani's office, you can see these posters. These posters were there. These people. They were connected, and that art was important for them through print. But it's not, art doesn't only travel through digital electronic means. It travels in print form in magazines that were circulated and distributed. Does that answer a bit your question? The second. Yeah. Yeah. The point of, we can come back to it, the point about violence.
Because the next question does sort of deal with it. So yeah. So towards the end of Cosmopolitan Radicalism, you explore the aesthetics of the freedom fighter that emerged in what for many might seem like an unexpected place, children's books. Mm-hmm. How did the image of guerrilla freedom fighters influence children's book publishing?
So that continues on I forgot that we had added these slides. So this is, for instance, a series of posters that were done as a charity for Palestinian refugees, and artists from around the Arab world contributed their artwork for these posters, and they were distributed and sold off also as like for charity. So again, that idea of art becoming on poster. Next one, sorry, art in relation to poetry. This is again Kamal Boulata in collaboration with the poet Mahmoud Darwish, the Palestinian poet. This is another Iraqi artist. So again, posters and street art, but there's also books and little booklets were in distribution across the world as forms of solidarity publications. So you can see that this is, I don't know how it's pixelated, but you can see, for instance, here there's 7 different languages on that book, and that it was meant for circulation. And that's a book in commemoration of Ghassan Kanafani, the author, the editor I just mentioned, who was assassinated in 1972. So that's a commemoration for him. It's a book for him. So we just to go to your question, Gadi. So the gun. So I think that's the idea of the freedom fighter at that time as something, as being the becoming, particularly in the global south, the image, the central figure of the revolutionary subject, which changes things, right? And the revolutionary subject is not necessarily the worker, the factory worker, or the working class subject. It's here that this is the particularly the peasant from the countryside, and that takes up a revolutionary struggle, and that is an armed struggle. That's something, that's a figure I tried to trace, that try to and understand that its role across different places and struggles in from Latin America through Africa, Middle East, and Asia. And one of the things that sort of drew me to begin to think about what it meant then. What does revolutionary violence means, and what sort of questions we ask of it today when we're confronted with an image glorifying a figure with a gun? Because how would you symbolize a freedom fighter of that time if it were not that figure of someone with their gun? how the question that sort of became difficult is when I was looking at some publications that were produced in Beirut in the 70s for children's book, where in fact the image of that freedom fighter was also something that was glorified, and that the idea of the gun is the way, or the armed struggle is the way for liberation, is something that children, youth were actually reading in books. So this is where I began to look at how it might have been understood then, and why was it crucial for kids. And I think we do have a position that's very different to that today, and we need to understand and situate some of these images with the struggles or with the context of the time. So that's one way to. So when you mentioned that was something that happened across the West as well, and thinking of particularly some of the political movements like the Black Panther Party, and the way the gun was part of them as a form of self-defense, but also that they were linked and they were in solidarity with other movements in the Global South. So were, for instance, the Weather Underground, who in Chicago were, for instance, in protest, were saying, bring the war home in relation to Vietnam. So our war is also internal with the state that oppresses us. Now, coming to children's book and to the Palestinian case in particular, this is, I think, is a very good image that sort of shows that what the gun meant at that time. So one needs to, it's based on Kanafani's stories. He has short stories, and it's illustrated for children who were the age of 12 to 14. And it's like one of those, that particular image in the book is like one of those, what do you call them?
Spot the difference?
Spot the difference, yes. So on the right side, you've got the generation of the parents who were exiled, and they were carrying from their home, they're the refugees carrying the pouch, and it's a clouded sky, and this is they're leaving their home behind them. And this is the refugee generation of 1948. And you need to imagine that Palestinian children were born in refugee camps, so this is a second generation, grown up to see yet another wave of refugees in 1967, and their identity was always through the humanitarian lens of being the passive refugees in need of assistance, in need of care, living precariously, and with no agency of their own. The second panel shows a new generation, shows that revolutionary, that freedom fighter, that what was called the Fida'i in Arabic, who actually just is donning the kafiyeh, which is not just it's not just the peasant headgear, it's also the gear for anonymity, for guerrilla fighting, and carrying the gun instead of the pouch. The sun is shining, so there's hope in the horizon, there's change, and their home, what you see here, is in front of them, is the future, and that's the idea of liberation. And what's interesting in this is that it captures that moment, just like if we come back to Fanon's idea of revolutionary violence being being a cleansing force, was something that was significantly different, significantly important in changing one's imagination of oneself, one's self-identity, and it was empowering. And it was that the idea that you're no longer, that change of identity, you're no longer a passive refugee, you're now an actor with agency to change your future.
Why is the agency had to be a gun? Why not a pen? Why not the very pen that was used to do the image?
Well, some of the artists did that, right?
So do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know what you're saying, but this was a huge debate and continues to be a huge debate. Why is that question is only, I think, I'm sorry, I forgot your name, but has asked a key question, said a key point, that why do we always ask the question around violence when it is that of the oppressed itself enacting that violence, but we don't ask that question about violence when it's state enacting that violence every day?
Well, we do.
We normalize it. We can do both, right? When we in a
yeah.
critical setting we do both,
Yeah.
but it's as if and there were moments where that was not what was thought as the possibility to change things. That there were attempts at diplomacies, there were attempts at different things, but it was impossible, and that was. It was a discursive hegemonic moment. It was also a belief that can change things, and that it has succeeded in places like Cuba. It has succeeded in places like Algeria. It has succeeded in places like Vietnam. Those who are oppressed, who are within a complete asymmetrical balance of power. Imagine the Vietnamese against the most powerful military force in the world at that time, and they were able to incur defeat on the US. That was inspiring for every oppressed people to actually carry the very simplest of guns, and that's the whole idea of guerrilla tactics, is that it's based on that imbalance of power. It's not because it's those who do not have the means to control violence. It's those who have violence incurred on them that's their means to resist and to liberate. And there's so many treatises on how, or theories of ways of guerrilla fighting and the way that it had in the 60s in particular. More has been written from Mao to Guevara about, or to Regis Debray or others who talked about urban guerrilla in Latin America as the means to liberate from colonialism. Your word can be censored, your word can be crushed, but there are other ways to do so. I don't necessarily subscribe to it, but I'm trying to understand how this became such a truth at that time.
I think just to your point also, and again around the discussion of violence, of like these imageries were coming out at times, as you're saying, of wars of independence, and countries like Vietnam and Algeria gaining independence through the army, through organized, not even army, but like guerrilla warfare, and also the parallel between imperial powers like France framing Algerian freedom fighters as terrorists, and using that imagery of them with guns, and whilst ignoring how French imperialism was in fact terrorizing Algerian people for decades. And it is this thing of framing this particular type of violence. Again, when we talk about the Black Panther Party being seen as a terrorist party, and then certain anti-racist figures being seen as non-violent, even erasing the fact that they were, as I was saying, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, they weren't just people who only praised peace, but who had
non-violence doesn't mean without any force.
But
quite the opposite.
There's usually a whitewashing of these figures as being only non-violent, when
the question for me anyway, is to do with physical permanent damage that certain violence does. Whereas other forms of, you could even say violence, divine violence, don't.
I think we're talking last resort,
So,
aren't we? It's only after everything else has been explored and exhausted, and they're just absolutely desperate.
Also, those exist together in parallel at the same time. It's not just people using guns. It's as we're seeing, it's sharing imagery, sharing ideology,
sharing venerates a certain kind of action there. It doesn't. The imagery doesn't bring. It doesn't seem to, for me anyway. It just makes me feel that.
I think we will sort of explore some of the
alienated from-
other sides of the violence as well as the Civil War gets going. I suppose that's the other.
Yeah, we can get to that. I think it's also that one needs to look at that historical moment, and I'm trying to do that, but also understand that that violence also got to have counter-revolutionary violence to it. So that's what eventually led to a civil war that was part of an international war of counter-revolution, so that, or counter-insurgency. So, and it just, it becomes a protracted, long, very deadly, destructive war.
I quite like the thing that you sort of talked about with Yasser Arafat, actually, about the piece.
Yeah, the olive branch or the gun. So he that was, so maybe the next slide. So perhaps I'll come to Arafat in a second, but just the idea that that booklet was part of a series of books that were published by a newly founded publishing house called Dar al-Fata al-Arabi, which is the publishing house for children. It was the first Arabic children books published, focused on on children in Arabic. And it was partially funded by the PLO, by the Palestinian Liberation Organization, but it was also grouped so many different artists that we were talking about before that thought that in order to actually incur or make any change, we need to start with the new generation. And we need to start with those children in the camps who have no understanding of where they're coming from, or the idea of Palestine or home is something that's completely severed from them, and their education in schools is not something that is appropriate to the revolutionary moment that is happening. And why should we? And there were lots of debates and questions. Why should we actually give children these sort of ladybird or ladybug? What was it? They were translated to Arabic actually, or the French equivalent. Give them these books that are meant to sort of, whitewash or whatever, that the reality when they're living in camps, their siblings are probably carrying a gun every day, going to fighting, maybe on the fronts, and maybe they've died, they hear the bombing, they hear the shells, they're part of that reality. Why should we shield them from that rather than actually give them something that gets them to understand and imagine it doesn't make sense to sort of, they're going to be reading about a perfect happy family, on a, having dinner on a bourgeois dinner table somewhere, that just, so they were people, intellectuals began to write, artists drew, so there was that sense of how do we write, how do we publish for children living a completely different reality and a revolutionary one. So this is about also how do we help them overcome their fears, basically, of what's going on. Who is a fidai? What your brother is doing? Or so stories like this. This is again Helmi Touni, who you've seen this beautiful, birds and poetry, and this is an illustration for a story about a camp and a child in a camp and what goes on in there. So just go to the next one. There was also that whole publishing house was engaged. So one is to think of, the education of a child in a revolutionary moment, in a child in exile, and also to think about the aesthetics of decolonization at that time. So this is the main art director of that is an Egyptian called Muhyiddin al-Labbad, and he writes in this is something he does much later, but how he began to think of the aesthetic forms that would appeal to that locality, to that moment, and to that child, to an Arab child at that time. And how much some of what we take for granted in aesthetics is actually as universal is in fact really founded on European particularity, and what today's art world in the Europe is completely taken by decolonizing this and these were things that were thought of in the 60s and 70s by these artists then. So on the right he talks about how as an artist he began to, through his training, he began to realize that as he was painting, he bought these paint tubes called with flesh color, and how flesh color is different than the color of his skin. So what's understood just taken for granted as, and how he needed to create a different combination to create something that was similar to his own reality, to his own colors. And on the left is something else about what is understood aesthetically in terms of like what implies swiftness, what implies who's the heroic figure. So the Superman hero versus a folkloric Arab hero, folkloric folk tales of Antar. So that he contrasts these, and he, like, where do we draw our inspiration? How do we root back our, decolonize basically, how do we root back our aesthetics and imagination of the child? And how even something as, the translated books like Lady Bird or even Superman, which was translated to Arabic, the translation might have been great in language, right? But the images were just flipped. Arabic reads from right to left, not left to right. So if you flip the images, while Superman should be going out of the page, in like this leaping out, flying, if you flip them, he hits the internal spine of the page. So it's as simple as that. So one needs to reinvent the forms and the shapes of things. So that was part of the project of Dar al-Fatah. And the next one comes to your question. So it just really brought on board so many artists from the Arab world just to produce and to experiment within their own styles something for children. The image on the top right is called Home. Maybe if we go next, I don't know if I've put an image of it.
I don't know.
That's it. That's the last one. Okay, so you will need to look at it in the book. But that home is the one that I began to think about the question of language for children, aesthetics for children, but also the revolutionary moment. Home is a very simple, little book that you hold in your hand like that, part of that series, that explains to a child what the meaning of occupation. So what does it mean? Everyone has a home. It's a universal need. Even animals have their home, and it explains like the horse lives in the stables, the fish lives in the waters, the blah blah blah. Every animal. All children live in their homes, and you can see them in different kinds of vernacular. But it then turns to the critical point that the Palestinian doesn't have a home. He or she lives in tents, and what should we do about that? Who has occupied his home? So it begins with that notion of home and occupation and what's to be done, and ends with the idea of the gun. And I spent time thinking about what does that mean. But that home itself as a booklet, it brings me to the Yasser Arafat, was actually used by Yasser Arafat, or it traveled with Yasser Arafat, who was the chairman of the PLO in 1974, when he was invited to speak for the first time on behalf of the Palestinian people officially in the United Nations. And it was translated to 4 different languages and distributed on those who were the attending delegates. And in his speech, Yasser Arafat made the cause for Palestine, and at the end ended with the idea that I come to you here with one hand the gun, and in the other hand branch, the branch from an olive tree, and which is the peaceful sign. So on one side it's the sign of violence, of armed struggle, and the other it's so he was in a space of diplomacy and saying this and saying, I'm basically asking that you let me let go of my gun in order to resolve the problem and that liberation struggle through forms of diplomacy, through peace, through the olive branch. And there was a standing ovation for his speech. And I talk about that at that moment, most of the delegates were from newly liberated countries that became part of the United Nations. Most of those liberated countries had also gone through violent forms or through armed struggle. So no one contested the question of the gun then, right? And there was a standing ovation. No one contested that on this little booklet in the heart of the United Nations in New York, the headquarters, that it had a gun at the end of it, that this is how we liberate the country. No one contested that. In fact, that little booklet, the official PLO translations were to 4 languages, French, Spanish, and I forgot which other language. But then there were like 12 other translations from activist networks of solidarity. It was translated to Swedish, to Persian, to all sorts of different languages, and distributed around the world, as became symbolic of that struggle and that idea of home, and what does that liberation of home requires at that time, up until the 80s, where something changed. That's the story I tell in the book. Something changes, and something changes in which today we cannot. That what you're talking about, the idea of a gun as a means of struggle and resistance, is no longer as accepted and thought as legitimate mean of struggle as people did then, let alone it's so normalized for it to be on a children's books. I do want to say something. Anti-colonialism, which is today, or decolonization, which is today a very I think a co-opted term by establishment, was not sweet and happy and simple. It required very difficult ethical questions and considerations, and people died through these processes, or knew that they were actually sacrificing themselves and for something.
I just have to say that in my point of view, it's just my point of view, is that I'm yet to be convinced that any armed struggle led to any kind of decolonialization. It is actually the processes behind and post these struggles, usually the struggles to rid oneself of that sort of like violence in society, that brings a certain beginnings of decolonialization.
I wouldn't disagree with you, because I think we also learn from some of the there are problems that it had created in certain parts, but it succeeded in some parts of the world that it didn't in others, and it created what were known and developed as counterinsurgency tactics that led to certain parts of the world remaining in perpetual violence, and that's a different struggle we want to overcome. So it's not a straightforward answer, but it's just also to think that it's not also straightforward to decolonize.
It isn't. It's a very, very complex process. Yeah. Or for me, it's just that the kind of that physical violence. It lives it makes it more complex over time.
Yeah.
It gives you the illusion that you're done, but
it's more the case that the colonialists don't quit. So whatever tactic you use against them, they will do a countermeasure. The war is just never ended.
Hang on a minute. That really won't. There are some perfectly simple historical examples where violence has succeeded in getting rid of the colonists. There are others where it hasn't, sure. But to say there are none.
I'm saying that there are none because it is a question of time as well. You get rid of, say, officially the Brits or whatever, yeah. And if you do it by violence, then the place becomes violent based on violence. You need to rid your own society from the
place was already
as well.
violent because of the
Taken
context.
by
You
violence.
don't start from a sort of empty canvas. Think of the ANC in South Africa. Think of the Vietnamese.
Well, precisely, you have a society. You have societies in South Africa that is very, very violent, unfortunately.
But nobody's arguing that decolonising automatically gets rid of violence. What we're arguing about is whether violence can ever lead to the defeat of the occupier.
The thing is that it doesn't bring to because the occupier is still there.
Ask somebody who lived in such a place.
I have actually. That is actually
your answer's not sufficient.
Maybe you should speak to people who live in Vietnam and talk to you about France. Maybe you should speak to people in South Africa. Yeah. That think that problems, that really deep problems that came precisely through the process of violence, of physical violence. You should maybe speak with people in Palestine who are very.
Nobody is denying that. It's a very simple
that's the thing. The thing is, the
ignoring
proposition is that what I'm saying is that, in a sense, the revolutionary act isn't revolutionary in itself when it is conservatively adhering to physical violence. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, and you're historically correct in some instances, incorrect in others.
Maybe,
you know something about the Second World War, for instance. Anyway, let's not hold the conversation.
The French resistance is like really thought of as it's not thought of as violent, but thought of it as very heroic act of resistance to the very violent Nazis, right, or to the German occupation.
But it required violence.
The French resistance was violent, but it's never remembered.
I know.
In its
I think
violence.
that's what you were speaking to. How there is a sort of a kind of a cleansing of history because we don't want to be seen to be advocating violent resistance. So it's like, Rosa Parks just sat there meekly and let it all happen, which is just not the reality.
And I suppose what I think is quite interesting about what you're working on is, in a way, it isn't cleansing this, it's trying to deal with the problematic without sort of just creating a rosy picture that we can just kind of then leave behind. Like, it might be that some of the violence wasn't good, but at least we can actually sit with it and actually think about why they were going, why they chose that as the option. And if it was good, then you can talk about the movements where it was successful. But it's about sitting with that.
I think I'm not trying to make a judgment of that in the book, but trying to really understand how these images how to understand them within their context and what they meant and what sort of spaces of imagination they allowed and enabled, and try to take the most polemical, most difficult place in thinking of children's books and trying to understand why and what did colonization really meant then, basically, it's just not it's a very different framework from trying to understand how the term is used today, what liberation was. It's not just a rosy, and these were debated terms. It's not that everybody agreed to that, and yeah,
And I guess,
not monolithically, yeah.
I guess that's one of the problems with the overuse of the word, things like decolonize, because you often see it just used with any kind of particular topic, and it is quite good to actually go back and think about its history and actually how it came about.
It's a painful process. It's an unfinished one, actually, on many levels.
So, in Off the Wall, you write that artists mostly on the left side of local politics, who were taken in by the fervour of progressive projects and revolutionary causes in the 1960s and 70s, withdrew from activism in the struggle as the struggle diverged from its initial reformist goals and crept along narrow confessional lines and into irrational violence. How did poster design change throughout the Civil War period from 1975 to 1990?
So that's a question to the
first book.
It's actually the first book,
but it feels like it's the second.
Books. Maybe we can look at the Signs of Conflict website.
Yeah.
So I think it's a good way to actually end and think about the difficulties of this issue. So
we can see.
So this is a website if you're interested in the Civil War and how it was a microcosm of politics of that moment internationally, because Lebanon was not the exception. So the Civil War was what I would think it was a way to divide and rule and a way to enact a counterinsurgency to the revolutionary moment. So the Civil War in Lebanon began in 1975 by arming exactly the phalangists that you were talking about that before. So it's the right-wing ultra-nationalists who were funded to become the state surrogate against the revolutionary left and the Palestinian resistance inside Lebanon. So, and that's something that you start seeing not just in Lebanon but across Latin America, that you create divisions internal to the population in order to, rather than intervene directly as a form of counter-insurgency to stop the revolutionary struggle, you actually divide the population against put them up against the revolutionaries. And that was an attempt also in Vietnam, but the lessons were learned and things were more complex in the Arab world and in Lebanon in particular, because historically Lebanon has been divided along sectarian religious lines by French colonialism. So it was a way to create Lebanon as divided out of Syria initially, based on creating a Christian entity that would be allied to the West. So when it was beginning to topple to the other side and become a nodal city, nodal space for revolution, like you can see Vietnam, Palestine, that poster, that was not, it would cause yet another defeat for imperialists at that time to see that losing. So that's what one measure was that Civil War, and that challenged some of the initial ideologies of revolution, and then began to the killing was happening on sectarian lines, and particularly from the phalangists who wanted to maintain Lebanon being a Christian on the right, on the side of the US, and in fact on the side of Israel. They were armed and trained by Israeli forces. So things shifted by the beginning of the war. You see the first 2 years were still the left was still painting that revolutionary struggle idea, the connections up until the late 70s, something that you see in the middle poster, you have the figures of different symbols of the international revolutionary left. But then things were more bitter as the war actually went on for 15, 16 years. And it wasn't just a civil war, it was a war that Lebanon got occupied by Israel already in 1978, in creating a buffer zone on the south, which is on the border between Lebanon, Israel, Palestine. And then Beirut was also occupied in 1982. Lebanon, most of it was up until Beirut, the capital, was occupied by Israel. And in fact, crushing, what this is in the other book, I talk about the crushing of the Arab Hanoi happened in 1982. It's when the PLO was forced to leave. It's when the left had to go underground, or flee, and Beirut was practically destroyed. And so that revolutionary moment, the Palestinian revolutionary moment, was just, or the Arab revolutionary moment, the dreams of Dar al-Fatah al-Arabi for children, for the new youth, for the youth to come, for a new world, just was crushed then. And after that, most of the violence was mainly sectarian violence and territorial violence and power struggles in Lebanon.
Wasn't it occupied by the Syrians at some point?
It wasn't an occupation by the Syrians. I mean, it's a debated term because the Syrian army was invited at different points by different factions to support, and it played a really nasty role in terms of, again, also dividing and ruling. So it had its. In 1976, the Syrian army came in as part of what was called the Arab Deterrent Force, which was an agreement within the Arab League of Nations. And that was mainly to deter, the deterrence was against the Palestinian Revolution. It was not, but eventually things changed, politics did change. I tried to trace that exactly through these 15 years of war, through and their politics and the changing politics, through the political posters and the narratives through the posters of the different fighting factions and their positions. So for instance, on the left, the middle poster, the figure on the left is what was the leader, is Kemal Jumblat, what was the leader of the national movement that was allied with the Palestinian forces. He was the leader of the Progressive Socialist Party in Lebanon. By the 80s, that same figure was used by communities for sectarian representation, was seen as a Druze leader, so as it's a particular sect within Islam, within Muslim communities. So what used to be a leftist international icon, he was actually given the Lenin Prize.
Was it the Labour Party, Amal?
No, it wasn't.
Okay.
It's Progressive Socialist Party.
Okay, so.
And you see him next to Guevara, Patrice Lumumba, and Ho Chi Minh, becomes a very like a Druze lord because he was actually killed, in fact, by the Syrians in 1977. So after his death in the 80s and after 82, things just really, that violence becomes just about territorial control and a completely divided country, sectarian divided country. So in a way, the counterinsurgency worked. The revolutionary struggle was lost, was defeated by creating an internal political sectarian struggle. And then it's claimed like, the Middle East doesn't have politics, it only has sectarian, This is what you see as coverage usually of the Middle East, of sectarian struggles, religious struggles, but these religious struggles were created as forms of counterinsurgency to rid of any revolutionary left. And Lebanon is just an example. And we see similar tactics in places in Latin America where it's not sectarian, but another form of division that would happen. But yeah, there's 700 posters if you want to look at that website and the archive. So that again answers your question about what do we do. And so yeah, and there's an online exhibition. And
That's great.
How do you feel? I've got two questions left. What do you think?
I think we're exhausted.
Yeah,
I think it's a good moment to see if there are any questions.
Yeah, that's good.
Just there's too much to take in. I think
There's a lot to take in, isn't there?
So if you have any questions or any thoughts or discussions, we can have. I don't know what time it is.
It's coming up to 10.
Yeah.
So yeah. So it's coming up to 10.
So we've been going on.
So yeah.
Thank you so much. It was
You're
so
welcome.
interesting.
Thanks for coming.
Really interesting. Something I knew nothing about, so it's always good.
Yeah, and thanks to wonderful questions and really close reading.
Yeah.
Really, I was like, wow.
They're so fascinating. They're both really fascinating books. I do really recommend them.
Thank you.
I haven't read any new one, but I would love to read a new one. And it's just I feel like it's a real pleasure to be actually able to think about Lebanon in a way that I haven't really ever had a chance to sort of understand it, really. And there's so much that I feel like I can relate to in some respects. And I think that makes it kind of really exciting.
That's great, thank you. And the idea that you can relate to is so important because most of media coverage of the Arab world today or the Middle East is that this place of that is unrelatable in fact, of like tribal, backward, it's still that sort of colonial framing that, and it's important to be able to change this and to say, we shared some things, we shared struggles, we had dreams together, or people then had dreams together, and they were moments of solidarity. In fact, that led to the latest book. Wait, no. I hope it hasn't disappeared. No.
There should be another one. Oh, it's down there.
Because that's my only copy. So we're having a book launch next week if you want to come. If you can write your email on a piece of paper, I can send you.
Oh yeah.
That's it. It's next Thursday. It's an edited collection, so I'm not the only author. But it comes from the Cosmopolitan Radicalism, and it's from a conference on rethinking the 60s from the global perspectives of anti-colonial struggle and what did actually revolution mean then? What did it mean to what was radical about the 60s if we discount the larger part of the world's struggles and the solidarities that were taking place, things that hidden histories of, for instance, we know so much about May 68 in France, but we don't know how much they were actually, the idea of the new left then was a solidarity with the immigrant worker, right? That's something that's erased from any memory of 68. It's almost like a youth revolt but there was something else that was going on. And we try to rewrite that moment through other perspectives. So thank you all for coming and staying so late.
Yeah, thank you everyone. It's been really good.
Oh, thanks for organising.
Thank you so much for organising and preparing and really just...
Yeah, no, I've really enjoyed
Thank
really
you
getting
so
into it.
much.
It's been really great. Thank you for listening. This has been the Exploding Appendix podcast. If you like this and you'd like to check out more of our work, please visit www.explodingappendix.com or follow us on Instagram, SoundCloud, YouTube, Eventbrite or Twitter. Exploding Appendix, ideas and culture with guts.